The air in the archive was a dead thing, scrubbed of life and scent, until it was nothing more than a medium for the transmission of light and data. It was sterile, cold, and perfect. Elian breathed it in, a shallow metered inhalation that did not disturb the placid surface of his control. Here, surrounded by the silent, shimmering columns of raw information, he was safe. Here he was simply Analyst 734, a beta of unremarkable genetics and methodical precision. The title was a shield. The air was a fortress. The suppressants humming in his bloodstream were the lock on the gate. He traced a finger over the cool, glassine surface of a data slate, his reflection a pale, indistinct smear in the polished obsidian. His face was a carefully constructed mask of neutrality, his posture a study in non-aggression. He had practiced this in front of mirrors for years, smoothing away the subtle tells, the fractional shifts in expression that might betray the biology he kept chained in the marrow of his bones. He was not an asset. He was not a weakness. He was a function, a cog in the grand, sterile machine of the consortium. The faint tremor in his hand was the only crack in the facade, a persistent, unwelcome reminder of the chemical war being waged within him. The suppressants were a brutalist solution, a chemical sledgehammer that crushed his natural scent, flattened his hormonal responses, and left a residue of exhaustion that clung to him like grave dust. But they worked. For 12 years, they had worked. He was a ghost, a scentless, categoryless man in a society obsessed with designation. He was a lie that had survived long enough to feel like a truth. The chime that announced a priority arrival was a discordant note in the archive's funereal quiet. It was sharp, authoritative, a sound designed to command attention. Elian's focus did not waver from the data stream flowing across his slate. Priority arrivals were for the sector overseer, not for him. His clearance was amber, not crimson. He was background noise, a part of the architecture. The heavy pressurized door hissed open and the dead air stirred. With the movement of air came something else, something that bypassed the filters and the scrubbers and the absolute sterility of the chamber. It was a scent, not a perfume or an artificial fragrance, but something elemental, alive. Ozone after a lightning strike, the sharp tang of frost on iron, the deep, resonant warmth of ancient wood. It was complex and clean and utterly dominant. It was Alpha. Elian's heart stuttered, a frantic, terrified bird beating against the cage of his ribs. His training, his years of brutal self-discipline, screamed at him to remain still, to show no reaction. He was Beta. Alphas were a matter of academic indifference to him. He kept his eyes locked on the slate, the glowing glyphs blurring into meaningless shapes. The scent grew stronger, resolving itself as two figures approached his workstation. He could feel the proximity as a change in pressure, a subtle shift in the gravitational pull of the room. One was Overseer Thorn, his own scent a bland, forgettable thing, the scent of paperwork and lukewarm synth calf. The other was the Storm. Analyst 734, Thorn's voice was tight, strained with a deference that bordered on fear. This is Commander Kale. He is assuming direct oversight of Project Chimera for the duration of his assessment. Elian forced himself to stand, to turn slowly, to execute the perfect, unobtrusive bow of a subordinate. He kept his eyes lowered, fixed on a point somewhere in the middle of the commander's polished black uniform. He could not look at the man's face. To meet his eyes would be to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny was death. "Commander," he murmured, his voice a practiced monotone. The silence that followed stretched into an eternity. Elian could feel the commander's gaze on him, a physical weight, a diagnostic beam scanning his every cell. The ozone and iron scent was a physical presence now, coiling in the air around him, making the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. It was not aggressive, not overtly threatening, but its sheer potency was an act of intimidation. It was a declaration of presence, of power, of absolute biological certainty. It was everything Elian was not. "Rise, analyst," the commander's voice was a low baritone, calm and measured, yet it vibrated through the floor plates and up Elian's spine. It held the same resonant quality as his scent. Elian straightened, finally daring to lift his gaze. Commander Kale was tall, built with a lean, efficient strength that his severe, high-collared uniform only accentuated. His hair was black, cut short and precise, and his eyes were a startling pale gray, the color of a winter sky. They were calm, intelligent, and utterly focused on him. And in them, Elian saw it. Recognition. It wasn't a flash of suspicion or a flicker of curiosity. It was a deep, quiet, instantaneous certainty. It was a look that bypassed the suppressants, the training, the 12 years of lies, and saw the frantic, terrified creature hiding beneath. The commander's expression did not change. Not a single muscle in his face moved, but his scent for a fraction of a second deepened, a subtle shift from ozone and iron to something richer, darker, the scent of pine resin and scorched earth, the scent of a predator that has found its prey. Elian's blood ran cold. The fortress had been breached. The lock was broken. He was seen. And the man who saw him was the embodiment of the very system he had spent his entire life hiding from. He stood there, exposed in the sterile, silent heart of the archive, and waited for the world to end. The world, however, did not end. Commander Kale simply gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "Continue with your work, analyst. I will be observing." He did not move away. He took a position several feet behind Elian's left shoulder, a silent, looming presence that completely disrupted the sterile geometry of the archive. He was a variable that the system had not accounted for, a singularity in Elian's carefully ordered universe. Overseer Thorne, after a moment of awkward shuffling, muttered an excuse and retreated, his relief palpable. He left Elian alone with the storm. Elian turned back to his console, his movements stiff, robotic. He tried to focus on the data streams, on the complex algorithms of Project Chimera, a predictive modeling program for resource allocation. It was his life's work, a project of such intricate detail that it usually consumed him entirely. Now the glyphs were just light, the numbers were just shapes. His entire consciousness had collapsed into a single point of awareness, the Alpha standing behind him. He could feel the man's stillness. He could hear the soft, almost inaudible sound of his own breathing. And he was certain the commander could hear the frantic, percussive rhythm of his heart. The scent was a constant pressure, a low hum against his senses. It did not fill the room. It seemed to emanate from the commander in a controlled, contained field, yet it was more potent than any broadcasted pheromone Elian had ever encountered. It was a scent that spoke of discipline, of immense power held in perfect check, and it was tearing through his defenses. A faint, cloying sweetness, the ghost of terrified Omega, threatened to leak from his pores. It was the scent of apricot and almond, a scent he hadn't smelled on himself since he was a boy, before the suppressants had bleached it out of him. He clenched his fists under the console, digging his nails into his palms, the sharp sting of pain a welcome anchor in the rising tide of panic. He forced himself to work, to move the data blocks, to run the simulations. His fingers flew across the holographic interface, the muscle memory of his job a flimsy shield against the commander's silent scrutiny. An hour passed. Then another. The commander did not speak. He did not move. He simply watched. The sustained, silent observation was a form of torture more refined than any physical threat. It was an interrogation without questions. It allowed Elian's own fear to do the work. Why wasn't he saying anything? Why hadn't he called the enforcers? Consortium protocol was absolute. An unregistered, unsuppressed Omega, or one whose suppressants were failing, was a Class 1 biohazard. They were to be contained immediately. To be in the presence of one was to be contaminated, to be compromised. Commander Kyle was the epitome of the consortium's ideals, a decorated enforcer. His inaction was not just a breach of protocol, it was an impossibility. The silence was a weapon, and it was dismantling Elian piece by piece. Finally, a low chime from the console indicated the completion of a complex simulation. Elian's report was due. His hands trembled as he finalized the data packet, his own biometric signature required for submission. He pressed his thumb to the scanner. The system registered him. Analyst 734, Beta. The lie held, for now. Your efficiency has decreased by 14.7% since my arrival. Commander Kyle's voice was quiet, conversational, yet it made Elian flinch as if struck. Is there a problem, Analyst? Elian kept his back to him. He could not risk letting the man see the sheen of cold sweat on his forehead. No, Commander, I was rerunning diagnostics to ensure accuracy for your review. It was a weak lie, transparent and clumsy. There is no need, Kale said. He moved then, a silent, fluid motion that brought him directly beside Elian's chair. Elian froze, every muscle in his body rigid. The commander leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on the screen, but his proximity was overwhelming. The heat radiating from his body, the sheer density of his presence, was suffocating. The scent of ozone and iron was now threaded with something else, something sharp and inquisitive. He was actively scenting him. He was tasting the air around Elian, analyzing the subtle chemical signals his body was leaking in its terror. The Chimera model is flawed, Kale stated, his voice still low and even. He pointed a gloved finger at a specific data string on the screen. Your projection for agricultural yield in Sector Gamma fails to account for the accelerated atmospheric degradation reported last cycle. The nutrient synthesizers will fail. The projection is optimistic by at least a full standard deviation. Elian stared at the data. The commander was right. It was an oversight, a small but critical error born of his distraction. His focus, once his greatest asset, was shattered. I will correct it immediately, Commander. You will, Kyle agreed. He did not move away. His hand remained near the screen, his finger hovering over the flawed data. His presence was a constant, unnerving pressure point. The consortium values precision, Analyst 734. It is the foundation of our stability. A single miscalculation can cause a cascade of failure. A single impurity can compromise the entire system. The word hung in the air between them. Impurity. It was a clinical term, devoid of emotion, but it landed on Elian like a death sentence. He knew what Kale was saying. He knew this was not about agricultural yields. He was the impurity. He was the miscalculation. And still the commander did nothing. He straightened up, his shadow falling over Elian. Fix it, he commanded softly. I will return at the end of this cycle to review your corrections. And with that he turned and walked away, his footsteps silent on the polished floor. The pressurized door hissed open, then shut, and he was gone. The overwhelming scent of alpha dissipated, leaving behind a ghost of ozone in the dead air. Elian collapsed back into his chair, his body shaking uncontrollably. He was not safe. He had not been exposed, but he had been marked. The commander knew. He knew, and for some reason, he was playing a game. A terrifying, incomprehensible game where Elian was the only piece on the board, and the rules were known only to the Alpha who held his life in his hands. The archive, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The silent columns of light were bars, the sterile air a vacuum threatening to suffocate him. Every soft chime, every whisper of the ventilation system sent a jolt of fresh panic through his veins. Commander Kale's parting words echoed in his mind. An impurity can compromise the entire system. It was a threat wrapped in ideology, a promise delivered with chilling calm. Elian's hand still trembled as he tried to correct the flawed data model. His mind, usually a place of sharp, crystalline logic, was a maelstrom of fear. Why the game? Why the delay? The consortium did not play. It identified threats, and it neutralized them with brutal efficiency. To be an unregistered Omega was not a crime, it was a biological contamination. It was a condition to be cured, a process that involved stripping away one's identity and reprogramming one's instincts until nothing remained but a docile, compliant asset for a designated alpha. He had seen it happen. Years ago, when he was just a boy before his own presentation had declared itself with terrifying certainty, he had watched them take his neighbor, a quiet, gentle man who presented late, a baker who always smelled of warm bread and sweet yeast. One day the scent had changed, blooming into the soft, unmistakable fragrance of an Omega. The next day, the white, sterile vans of the Biosecurity Division had arrived. They had taken him away, and the man who returned months later was a hollow shell. His scent was gone, muted by chemical castration, his eyes vacant. He was assigned to a minor official in the administrative sector, and the warm, vibrant man was simply erased. That memory was the bedrock of Elian's fear. It was the reason he paid exorbitant sums for black market suppressants that gnawed at his insides, the reason he lived a life of monastic solitude. He was not an asset. He would not be erased. A flicker of movement in his peripheral vision made him jolt. It was just a maintenance drone, a silver disc humming quietly as it polished the floor. His paranoia was a fever, coloring every shadow, every sound. He looked at his reflection in the dark console screen. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a fear he could not quite conceal. He looked fragile. He looked like prey. He hated it. He hated the biology that made him this way, the pheromones that could betray him, the instincts that screamed at him to submit to the calm, powerful presence of an alpha like Kale. The attraction he'd felt, that terrifying magnetic pull towards the commander, was a biological imperative he had fought his entire life. It was a weakness, a flaw in his design that the consortium would exploit without a second thought. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to regain control. Kale had given him until the end of the cycle. That was a deadline, a test. He had to perform. He had to be the perfect beta analyst. He had to reinforce the lie until it was impenetrable. He submerged himself in the data, the familiar cold logic of the numbers, a lifeline in the churning sea of his emotions. He found the atmospheric degradation reports Kale had mentioned. The commander's access to that level of classified environmental data was far above what an enforcer overseeing a resource model should have. It meant Kale was more important, more deeply embedded in the consortium's inner workings than his title suggested. This realization did not bring comfort. It only made the Alpha's strange inaction more terrifying. A man with that kind of access did not break protocol on a whim. His every action was calculated. Elian worked with a desperate, frantic energy. He corrected the flaw, reran the simulations, cross-referenced his new projections with restricted shipping manifests he had to slice into. He was breaking minor protocols himself, but his own potential exposure was a far greater threat. As the end of the cycle neared, the archive's main lighting dimmed to a soft blue twilight, signaling the shift change. Most of the other analysts, all betas like him, packed their things and left in silence. Elian remained, putting the finishing touches on his report. The pressurized door hissed open again. Elian didn't need to see or hear. The sudden shift in the air, the return of that ozone and iron scent, announced the commander's arrival. This time, Elian did not allow himself to freeze. He finished his notation, saved the file, and turned his chair to face the Alpha, his movements measured and deliberate. It was a small act of defiance. He would not cower. Commander Kyle stood in the center of the room, his posture relaxed but radiating an aura of absolute authority. His pale gray eyes swept over Elian, an unreadable, analytical gaze. "Report," he said. It was not a request. "The corrections are complete, Commander," Elian replied, his voice impressively steady. "Your assessment was accurate. The revised model now reflects a 32% probability of cascading crop failure in Sector Gamma within the next 6 cycles." "Only 32%? Kale walked closer, stopping beside the console again. The scent was there, clean and sharp, but this time it felt less like a threat and more like a question. "Your model is still too optimistic, Analyst. You have factored in the atmospheric data, but you have failed to account for the human element." Elian frowned, genuinely confused. "The human element, Commander? The population of Sector Gamma is 98% beta. Their compliance and efficiency ratings are among the highest in the prefecture." "Precisely, Oa," Kyle said, a flicker of something almost like approval in his eyes. "They are efficient. They are compliant. They are also at the end of a long and poorly managed supply chain. When the first nutrient shortages occur, their efficiency will curdle into panic. Their compliance will become dissent. Your models are based on logic and predictable systems. Humans, Analysts, are neither. Adjust your parameters to include a panic index. Factor in the probability of riots." It was a stunningly cynical and seditious thing to say. The consortium's official doctrine was that its citizens were perfectly managed, their needs met, their emotions regulated. To speak of riots, of dissent, was tantamount to treason. And he was saying it to Elian, the impurity he had identified hours before. Elian stared at him, his mind racing. What was this? Another test? A trap to make him agree with a treasonous statement? He chose his words carefully. "Commander, such variables are not standard in consortium projection models. To include them would be to presume systemic failure." "Systems fail," Kale stated simply, his gaze unwavering. "It is the one constant. The only question is whether we are prepared for it when they do. Run the new simulation, Analyst. I will wait." He did not take his observation post behind Elian. Instead, he pulled a small metallic stool from a recessed compartment and sat opposite the console, facing Elian directly. He was no longer a shadow at his back, but a direct, unavoidable presence. He rested his elbows on his knees, his gloved hands clasped loosely in front of him, and he watched. He watched Elian's face, his hands, his every subtle shift in posture as Elian began to code the unthinkable, a simulation of his perfect, orderly world falling into chaos. The simulation ran, a silent, abstract ballet of cascading failures. On the holographic display, the neat, orderly grid of Sector Gamma devolved into crimson hotspots of unrest as the panic index Kyle had mandated took root. Supply lines fractured. Compliance ratings plummeted. The system, so perfect on paper, proved brittle in the face of unpredictable human fear. Elian watched the numbers, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. The commander's cynical prediction was not just plausible, according to the model, it was inevitable. The final projection was stark, a 78% probability of catastrophic social collapse in Sector Gamma. A failure of a magnitude the consortium would never publicly admit was possible. "As you predicted, Commander," Elian said, his voice quiet in the vast, silent room. Kyle's expression remained unreadable, his pale eyes fixed on the chaotic display. "Prediction is not the goal, Analyst. Prevention is. The model gives us a window, a chance to reinforce the supply lines, to reroute resources before the panic begins." He spoke the language of the consortium, the rhetoric of control and management, but his words were a direct contradiction of his earlier actions. He was using the system's tools to identify the system's rot. Elian felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. He was trapped in a conversation, layered with so much subtext it felt like speaking in code. On the surface, they were discussing logistics. Beneath that, they were discussing the fundamental instability of their world. And beneath that, on a level of pure instinct and scent, a silent, terrifying negotiation was taking place between an alpha and an omega. Kyle finally looked away from the screen, his gaze settling on Elian. The intensity of it made Elian's breath catch. "You are skilled, Analyst 734. Your work is precise, but you seem fatigued." The shift in topic was jarring. Elian's carefully constructed composure threatened to crack. "The project is demanding, Commander." "Indeed." Kyle stood, the motion fluid and silent. He walked around the console, and for one heart-stopping moment, Elian thought the commander would touch him. Instead, Kale stopped beside his chair, his presence a wall of warmth and power. "The consortium demands much, but it also provides. Your nutrient levels appear low. Your biomonitor readings are trending toward deficiency." He was quoting data from Elian's mandatory health monitor, a device embedded in the wrist of every citizen. He had access to Elian's private medical data. Of course he did. Elian's blood ran cold. The suppressants he took were unregistered, a black market chemical cocktail that caused vitamin deficiencies and cellular degradation. His biomonitor would show the symptoms if not the cause. It was more evidence, more proof of his impurity. "I am fine, Commander," Elian managed, his throat tight. Kyle was silent for a long moment. Elian could feel the man's gaze on the side of his face, on the pulse fluttering in his neck. He fought the primal urge to expose his throat, a gesture of absolute submission he hadn't felt in over a decade. It was a phantom instinct, a ghost in his blood, and Kale's proximity was resurrecting it. "No," Kale said softly, the word a definitive judgment. "You are not." He reached into a pouch on his tactical belt and placed a small silver packet on the console next to Elian's hand. It was a high-grade nutrient paste, military issue, the kind reserved for enforcers on long-duration missions. It was a restricted item. "Replenish your levels, Analyst," Kale ordered, his voice back to its neutral, commanding tone. "Your efficiency is a consortium asset. I will not have it compromised by poor self-maintenance." He turned and walked toward the exit without another word. The gesture was utterly contradictory. He was at once threatening Elian with exposure and showing him a form of care, however clinical. He was a predator who, upon finding a wounded animal, chose not to kill it, but to offer it food. Elian stared at the silver packet as the door hissed shut, leaving him once again in the humming silence. The packet was cool against the warmth of his skin when he finally reached for it. It was an offering. It was a warning. It was a chain. The commander was not just watching him, he was managing him. He was treating Elian like a volatile asset to be contained, controlled, and sustained. The realization was more terrifying than any overt threat. Kyle wasn't going to turn him in. He had some other purpose for him. Elian tore open the packet, his hand shaking, and squeezed the tasteless, nutrient-rich gel into his mouth. He was taking what the Alpha had given him. He was, in some small, fundamental way, accepting the commander's control. And as the nutrients hit his system, chasing away the faintness that had plagued him for weeks, he felt a sliver of strength return. It was a borrowed strength, a conditional reprieve, but he would use it. He had to understand the game Kyle was playing. He had to survive long enough to find a way to win it. The next few cycles settled into a new, terrifying rhythm. Commander Kyle was a constant presence in the archive. He did not always speak to Elian, but he was always there, a silent observer in the periphery, his focused stillness a constant weight on Elian's psyche. He would review Elian's work, his critiques always sharp, insightful, and pushing the boundaries of conventional consortium modeling. He forced Elian to factor in variables the system was designed to ignore, systemic decay, psychological stress fractures in the populace, the logistical impossibilities of the consortium's ever-expanding control. He was, in essence, making Elian map out the inevitable failure of the world they lived in. It was dangerous, seditious work disguised as high-level risk assessment. And through it all, the silent conversation continued. Call would leave a nutrient packet on the console when Elian's pallor became too pronounced. He once rerouted an atmospheric fan that was blowing a draft directly onto Elian's station. A small, almost unnoticeable adjustment that spoke volumes. They were the clinical, detached actions of a handler managing a delicate instrument. Yet they felt intensely personal. Elian, in turn, performed his role with flawless precision. He was the diligent beta analyst, his face a mask of neutral efficiency. He never acknowledged the commander's small kindnesses, just as he never acknowledged the simmering threat that lay beneath them. They communicated through data models and resource charts, their true meaning buried deep within the code. Elian's suppressants, however, were becoming less reliable. The commander's constant proximity, the low-level hum of his potent alpha scent, was like a solvent on the chemical locks in Elian's system. He started experiencing scent leaks, faint, ghostly traces of apricot and almond that would rise from his skin in moments of stress. He would catch a whisper of it himself and freeze, his blood turning to ice. But Kale never reacted. If he noticed the phantom scent, he gave no sign. It was another layer to his terrifying self-control, another turn of the screw in their psychological war. Elian felt like he was walking a tightrope over a canyon, with Kale watching from the other side, neither helping him nor letting him fall. One cycle, as he was deep in a complex simulation, a memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. It was triggered by the low, resonant hum of the archive's central server, a sound that suddenly reminded him of the reclamation drones that had patrolled the outer sectors where he'd grown up. He was a boy again, maybe 9 or 10, small for his age, huddled in a narrow alleyway with his mother. Her hand was clamped over his mouth, her own scent, lilac and rain, sharp with terror. They were hiding. A biosecurity patrol was sweeping the block, their scanners searching for unregistered scent signatures. Elian hadn't presented yet, but his mother, a gentle Omega who had lost her designated Alpha in a mining accident, was now considered unassigned. Dangerous. She had been using cheap, ineffective scent blockers that did little more than muddle her fragrance. A large, imposing enforcer had stopped at the mouth of their alley. Elian remembered the man's scent, acrid and aggressive, like burnt wiring and stale sweat. The enforcer had raised his scanner, and Elian had felt his mother's body go rigid with a terror so profound it was silent. He remembered the whine of the scanner, the awful suspended moment of waiting. And then another enforcer had called out. A distraction down the street, and the man had turned and moved on. They had been safe. But the terror of that moment, the feeling of being hunted for what you are, had been branded into his soul. His mother had acquired her first set of black market suppressants the next day. The lilac and rain scent had vanished forever, replaced by a chemical blankness and a deep, abiding sadness in her eyes. She had saved him from that life, but the cost had been the slow erasure of herself. Elian surfaced from the memory with a gasp, his heart pounding. He looked up, his eyes unfocused, and found Commander Kale watching him. Not from across the room, but from right beside his console. He hadn't heard him approach. Kale's expression was, for the first time, not entirely unreadable. There was a flicker of something in his pale gray eyes, a shadow of shared understanding. "A difficult memory analyst?" he asked, his voice low. Elian stiffened, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple. "I was lost in the data." "No," Kale said, his voice soft but firm, cutting through the lie. "You were elsewhere. Your heart rate spiked to 130 beats per minute. Your galvanic skin response was off the charts. You were afraid." He knew. He was monitoring Elian's vitals in real time. The realization was a fresh violation, another layer of his privacy stripped away. He felt like a specimen under a microscope. "My health is my own concern, Commander," Elian said, his voice sharp with the defiance he couldn't suppress, a dangerous, foolish spark of rebellion. Kyle's gaze didn't harden. If anything, it softened almost imperceptibly. "In the consortium," he said, his voice a near whisper, "nothing is ever our own." He held Elian's gaze for a long moment, and in that shared look, something shifted. The dynamic was no longer just predator and prey, handler and asset. It was something more complex. Two men trapped on opposite sides of the same brutal system, caught in a silent, dangerous orbit around a shared, unspoken truth. Kyle broke the contact first, straightening up. "There is a system-wide diagnostic drill scheduled for the next cycle," he stated, his tone shifting back to official business. "All personnel are to remain at their stations. The archives will be on lockdown for the duration. Be prepared." It was an order, but it felt like a warning, a premonition of something to come. He was telling Elian that the cage was about to get smaller, the walls were about to close in, and they would be locked inside it together. The tension in the archive began to build long before the lockdown drill was initiated. A new figure started making appearances, Commander Valerius. He was Kyle's superior, a man who moved with a reptilian stillness and whose scent was a thin, sterile razor of pure ethanol, as if he'd been chemically scoured of all natural pheromones. He was the system personified, cold, analytical, and utterly devoid of warmth. His eyes, a pale, flat blue, seemed to miss nothing. Valerius would stand with Overseer Thorne observing the archive from a distance, his gaze often sweeping over Kale, and then with unnerving focus landing on Elian. He never spoke to Elian directly, but his scrutiny was a palpable force, a chilling pressure that made Elian's skin crawl. He could feel the man assessing him, cataloging him, filing him away as a data point of interest. The interest was not in Analyst 734. It was in the anomaly of Commander Kale's sustained presence at his station. Kale's behavior was, by consortium standards, eccentric. A commander of his rank and caliber did not personally oversee a single analyst on a resource project for weeks on end. It was inefficient, illogical, and Valerius was a man who abhorred inefficiency. One afternoon, Elian was calibrating a data flow regulator when he overheard a fragment of their conversation, his enhanced hearing a side effect of his Omega biology he could never fully suppress, picking up their low voices from across the vast room. "An excessive allocation of your time, Kale," Valerius was saying, his voice a dry rasp. "Project Chimera is a secondary priority. All priorities are my concern when they show potential for systemic contagion." Kale's reply was smooth, professional. Analyst 734's models are unique. They require direct supervision to ensure they remain within acceptable parameters. "The analyst," Valerius said, and Elian could feel the weight of that pale blue gaze on him, even from a distance. "He appears unremarkable, a standard beta. His efficiency scores are high but not unprecedented. Unremarkable tools are often the most effective, Kyle countered, his voice betraying nothing. His lack of ambition makes him a stable, reliable processor, but he requires guidance. "See that your guidance yields results, Commander," Valerius said, a clear note of warning in his tone. "My patience for pet projects is limited. The prefecture has more pressing concerns than the theoretical models of a low-level functionary." The conversation ended. Valerius swept the room with one last cold glance and departed. The exchange left Elian trembling. Kyle had protected him, had created a justification for his presence, but it was a flimsy shield. He had painted Elian as a tool, a functionary, a stable processor. The words were dehumanizing, clinical, and yet they had been a defense. He was Cale's pet project. The thought was both terrifying and, in a strange, twisted way, validating. It meant he was, for whatever reason, important to the commander. It meant he was not just a random impurity Cale had decided to ignore. There was a purpose to this game. The day of the system-wide drill arrived, announced by a cold, synthetic voice from the overhead speakers. Crimson emergency lighting washed the archive in a hellish red glow, and heavy blast doors slammed shut with a deafening clang, sealing them inside. The air filtration system shifted to a closed loop, the hum dropping to a lower, more ominous pitch. The lockdown was total. It was, as Cale had warned, a cage. Elian's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt a primal, instinctual panic at being trapped, a feeling he'd suppressed since childhood. The red light, the sudden confinement, the oppressive silence that followed the clang of the doors. It was all designed to induce stress, to test the system's and its personnel's response to a crisis. For Elian, it was a direct assault on his control. His suppressants, already weakened, chose that moment to begin a catastrophic failure. It started as a faint tremor deep in his bones, a hum of biochemical static. Then came a wave of heat that washed over him, making his skin feel too tight. The ghost scent of apricot and almond was no longer a whisper. It was a distinct, undeniable fragrance, blooming from his pores, a sweet, desperate signal in the sterile air. He could smell himself. Panic, sharp and absolute, seized him. This was it. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The archive was small, enclosed. Cale was here. Elian hunched over his console, wrapping his arms around himself, trying to physically contain the scent, a hopeless, pathetic gesture. He felt a wave of dizziness, his vision tunneling. The world narrowed to the pounding in his ears and the sweet, damning scent filling the air around him. He was going into preheat. Here, now. He risked a glance at Kyle. The Alpha stood in the T-Galbot, center of the room, perfectly still. The crimson light carved sharp angles on his face, leaving his eyes in shadow. But Elian could feel the moment the scent hit him. Kyle's posture shifted, a minute, almost imperceptible tensing of his shoulders. His head tilted slightly like a predator catching a scent on the wind. Elian closed his eyes, bracing for the end, for the cold call to biosecurity, for the look of disgust, or worse, predatory interest in the Alpha's eyes. But nothing happened. Instead, he heard the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps approaching. He didn't open his eyes. He couldn't bear to see it. The footsteps stopped directly in front of his workstation. The air grew thick with the commander's own scent. But it was changing. The clean ozone and sharp iron were being deliberately suppressed, replaced by something deeper, richer. The scent of pine resin, of damp earth and crushed cedar. It was a calming scent, a territorial scent, an alpha scent designed not to challenge, but to shield, to cloak. Kyle was projecting his own pheromones, flooding the immediate area with a powerful, dominant scent that would overwhelm and mask Elian's own. He was hiding him, in plain sight. Elian's breath hitched, a choked, desperate sob. He finally forced his eyes open. Cale was standing before him, his expression grim, his pale eyes intense. He reached out, not to touch Elian, but to key a command into Elian's console. A small shielded compartment in the base of the workstation hissed open. It was a maintenance locker, barely large enough for a man to crawl into. "Inside! Now!" Cale's voice was a low, urgent command, pitched for Elian's ears only. There was no time to think, only to obey. Elian stumbled from his chair, his legs weak, and crammed himself into the small, dark space. It was a coffin of metal and wiring. Kyle swung the panel shut, plunging him into absolute darkness. He heard a soft click as a magnetic lock engaged. He was sealed in. Through the thin metal he could hear Cale's voice, now at its full, commanding volume, addressing the room's audio pickup. "Commander Cale, reporting a minor power fluctuation at Analyst Station 734, likely a side effect of the lockdown initiation. I am containing the area as a precaution until the diagnostic is complete. No breach, no biohazard." He was lying. He was lying to the entire security apparatus for him. Trapped in the dark, suffocating on his own terrified sweet scent, Elian finally understood. This was never a game of cat and mouse. From the very beginning, from that first, knowing glance, this had been an act of protection. A dangerous, insane, inexplicable act of protection. A wave of heat, more intense than before, washed through him, his body finally free from the suppressant's hold and triggered by the proximity of a powerful, non-threatening alpha, was surrendering to its nature. In the small, dark metal box, hidden by the very man who should have been his captor, Elian's carefully constructed world dissolved completely. The darkness in the maintenance locker was absolute, a thick, velvety black that pressed in on him from all sides. It should have been terrifying, claustrophobic, but instead it felt like a shield. The only sensory input was the low hum of the station's internal machinery, the close, cloying sweetness of his own scent, and the muffled, resonant timbre of Kyle's voice just outside the thin metal wall. He was a steady, calming presence, a bulwark against the red-lit chaos of the drill. Elian curled into a tight ball, pressing his forehead against the cool metal. The preheat was intensifying, a slow, deep burn that started in his belly and radiated outwards. It was an ache, a longing, a deep, cellular pull he hadn't felt since puberty. His body was betraying him, yet for the first time, the betrayal felt less like a failure and more like a surrender. He was no longer fighting it. He couldn't. The chemical dam had broken. Cale's voice cut through his feverish state. "Station 734. Confirmed system integrity." It was a direct order spoken into the console's comms unit. He was speaking to Elian. He was testing him. Could he still function? Could he still maintain the facade? Elian's hand trembled as he reached out in the dark, his fingers finding the cool glass of a small internal diagnostic panel he knew was there. He keyed in the standard confirmation code, the sequence ingrained in him by years of repetition. A soft green light blinked on the panel and he heard a corresponding chime from the console outside. "Integrity confirmed, Commander," Elian whispered, his voice hoarse, unrecognizable. "Power fluctuation contained." A long silence followed. Elian could picture Kyle on the other side, listening, analyzing the tremor in his voice, the scent that must be leaking through the locker's seams. He was assessing the damage. He was deciding his next move. The lockdown drill seemed to stretch for an eternity. The crimson lights outside cast thin, bloody lines through the ventilation slits in the locker door, striping the darkness. Elian's fever rose, his thoughts blurring at the edges. He was adrift in a sea of sensation and memory, the years of repression falling away like shed skin. He remembered the shame, the fear, the constant grinding effort of being someone else. He remembered the acrid taste of the suppressants, the way they scraped his throat, the way they hollowed him out from the inside. He had paid for his safety with his own vitality, his own self. Finally, the synthetic voice announced the conclusion of the drill. The crimson lights blinked out, replaced by the standard sterile white of the archive. The heavy blast doors groaned open with a release of pressure. The cage was unlocked. The immediate danger had passed. Elian remained in the dark, his body trembling with the aftershocks of fear and the onset of his heat. He heard the soft click of the magnetic lock on his locker being disengaged. The door swung open. Light, harsh and white, flooded the small space. Elian flinched, shielding his eyes. Cale stood there, his form a tall, dark silhouette against the brightness. He said nothing. He simply looked down at Elian, curled and exposed in the maintenance hatch. His face was unreadable, a mask of military discipline, but his scent was a complex storm of ozone, pine, and something else. Something Elian couldn't identify. It was sharp and anxious. Kyle was not as calm as he appeared. "Can you stand?" Kyle asked, his voice low and devoid of judgment. Elian nodded, though he wasn't sure it was true. He unfolded his cramped limbs, his muscles screaming in protest. As he tried to climb out, a wave of dizziness washed over him and he stumbled. A strong hand gripped his arm, steadying him. Kyle's touch was firm, impersonal, yet the contact sent a jolt through Elian's system, a spark of electricity on his feverish skin. The Alpha's grip was a brand, a claim. He helped Elian to his feet, but did not let go. "The air scrubbers will recalibrate in 5 minutes, Kyle said, his voice urgent, his gaze sweeping the now empty archive. "Your scent will be detected. We don't have much time." He was right. The sweet, heavy scent of an Omega in preheat was now thick in the air around the workstation. Once the system rebooted, every sensor in the facility would flag it. Kyle's clever masking attempt had been a temporary solution. "What?" Elian began, his mind too foggy to form a coherent plan. "Quiet," Kale commanded, but not unkindly. He released Elian's arm and turned to the console, his fingers flying across the interface. He initiated a full diagnostic purge of the workstation's local atmospheric sensors, citing a critical malfunction during the drill. It was a lie that would buy them a few more minutes, a data smokescreen. Then he turned back to Elian. He reached into his belt pouch again, but this time it wasn't a nutrient pack. He produced a small gray metallic injector, a hypospray. "What is that?" Elian asked, instinctively backing away. "A military-grade suppressant," Kale said, his eyes holding Elian's. "It's clean, stable. It will stop the heat before it fully begins, but it will not erase your scent completely. It will simply mute it, dampen it to a level the system might register as an anomaly, but not a clear Omega signature." He held it out. "This is your choice, analyst." The choice. To plunge back into the chemical twilight of suppression, or to be discovered. It wasn't a choice at all, but Kale offering it to him was everything. He wasn't forcing him. He was not asserting his dominance. He was giving Elian agency in his own survival. Elian looked at the hypospray, then at the Alpha's face. In the harsh white light of the archive, he could see the fine lines of tension around Kyle's eyes, the rigid set of his jaw. The commander was taking an immense risk. Harboring an Omega, falsifying reports, using restricted medical equipment. It was treason. "Why?" Elian whispered, the question he'd been holding back for weeks. "Why are you doing this?" Kale's mask of control finally cracked. A flicker of profound weariness, of deep, old pain crossed his features. "Because the system is flawed," he said, his voice barely audible. "Because precision should not be used as a weapon. And because my mother smelled of lilac and rain." The word struck Elian with the force of a physical blow. Lilac and rain. It was a scent from his own past, a memory he hadn't shared, a ghost Kale couldn't possibly know. Or perhaps it was a universal story, the story of a lost Omega, of a child who remembered the scent of a parent who had been erased by the system they now both served. In that moment, Elian understood. Kale was not his handler. He was his reflection, a different outcome of the same tragedy. With a hand that was surprisingly steady, Elian took the hypospray. He pressed it against his own neck, the hiss of the injector a final, definitive sound in the quiet archive. The cool liquid entered his bloodstream, a familiar poison that now felt like a reprieve. He looked at Kale, a silent understanding passing between them, a fragile alliance forged in shared trauma and sealed in a sterile room under the unblinking eye of a system they both intended to betray. The military-grade suppressant acted swiftly. The rising fever receded, the deep, pulling ache in his bones subsided, and the world sharpened back into focus. It was a clean, efficient chemical intervention, lacking the brutal, nauseating side effects of his black market cocktail. The cloying sweetness of his scent faded, muted to a faint, almost undetectable trace, like the memory of a fragrance rather than the fragrance itself. He was back in his cage, but the bars felt different now, less like a prison and more like a temporary fortification. Kyle watched him, his pale eyes tracking the subtle changes in Elian's posture, the return of color to his face. The tension in the alpha's shoulders eased fractionally. He had gambled, and for now the gamble had paid off. "It will hold for 72 hours, Kale stated, his voice returning to its usual measured cadence. He took the empty hypo spray from Elian's hand and concealed it. "By then, I will have more for you." A steady supply. The thought was both a relief and a new kind of chain. He was now dependent on Kale not just for his silence, but for the very chemicals that maintained his false identity. Their fates were now inextricably linked. "The sensor logs for this station have been corrupted," Kale continued, "all business. The official report will state a hardware failure. Overseer Thorne will accept it. He is a man who prefers not to see complications." Elian nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He felt a strange sense of calm settling over him, the aftermath of the adrenaline and panic. He had walked to the edge of the precipice and Kyle had pulled him back, but they were both still standing dangerously close to the edge. The nature of their interactions began to change in the cycles that followed. The subtext was still there, but it was no longer a threat. It was a shared secret, a silent language of complicity. Kyle still maintained his professional distance in the archive, but his presence was no longer a source of anxiety. It was a quiet reassurance. He would leave the small gray hypo sprays for Elian in dead drops, tucked inside a discarded data slate casing or left in the back of a nutrition dispenser. They never spoke of it. They never had to. One cycle, as Elian was working late, Kale approached his station. The archive was empty, the silence deep and profound. "Walk with me, analyst," Kale said. It was not a request. Elian saved his work and stood, his heart beginning a slow, heavy beat. Kyle led him away from the data stacks, toward a rarely used section of the archive, the physical media vault. It was a cold, dim place where obsolete paper documents and film were stored, a mausoleum of forgotten information. The air here was different. It smelled of dust and decaying paper, a scent of organic history that was a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of the main archive. Kyle stopped in front of a large observation window that looked out over the city. The prefecture was a breathtaking, terrible sight at night. A vast, glittering web of light and order stretching to the horizon. Towers of glass and steel pierced the perpetual synthetic twilight, their lights blinking in perfect, synchronized rhythm. It was the image of absolute control. "They call it the City of Order," Kyle said, his voice low as he stared out at the view. "A perfect system designed to eliminate chaos, to categorize, to manage, to optimize. They believe that if you can name a thing, you can control it. Alpha, Beta, Omega." He spoke the designations with a quiet contempt. "They believe biology is a simple equation to be solved, an impurity to be corrected." Elian stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from the Alpha's body. He did not feel the instinctual fear he once had. He felt anchored. "My father was an Alpha," Kale said, his gaze still fixed on the city. "A high-ranking ideologue. He believed in the system. He designed parts of it. When my mother presented as an Omega, he saw it as a flaw, a genetic stain on his perfect record. He handed her over to the reconditioning program himself." The confession was delivered in a flat, emotionless tone that made it all the more devastating. Elian could hear the lifetime of pain and rage buried beneath the calm. He told me she was being cured, Cale continued, for her own good, for the good of the system. I was 10. I believed him. When she came back, she was quiet. The scent of lilac and rain was gone. She didn't laugh anymore. She didn't look at me. She was a ghost in our house. She lived like that for 5 years, and then one day she walked into the sonic sanitation unit and didn't walk out. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the story. Cale had not just lost his mother to the system had used his own father as the weapon. I joined the enforcers to understand the system that broke her, Cale said, finally turning to look at Elian. His pale eyes were filled with a cold, hard light, and I learned that a system this perfect, this rigid, is also incredibly brittle. It has pressure points, flaws in its own logic. That is the purpose of Project Chimera. You are not just modeling resource allocation, Elian. He used his name. For the first time, he used his name, and it felt like a key turning in a lock deep inside him. You are mapping the system's weaknesses for me. Every projection of failure, every simulation of dissent, that is our weapon. A map to show us where to strike. Elian stared at him, the full scope of Cale's plan finally crashing down on him. This was not just about survival. This was about rebellion. Kyle had not just been protecting him. He had been recruiting him. He had seen not an Omega to be pitied, but an analyst with a unique mind, a tool he could use against the very people who had created them both. You saw me from the beginning, Elian breathed, the realization dawning. Not just as an Omega. You saw my work. I saw both, Kyle corrected him gently. I saw a precise, logical mind trapped in a body the system wishes to turn into a mindless asset. The ultimate irony. The very thing they hunt is the one thing that can give us the perspective we need to tear it all down. You see the flaws, Elian, because you have had to live your entire life as one. Cale reached out then, his movement slow, deliberate. He did not touch Elian's face or his shoulder. He gently took Elian's hand, the one that so often trembled from the suppressants. His gloved fingers wrapped around Elian's, his grip firm, steadying. The contact was electric, intimate, a silent pledge. I am not asking you to be a soldier, Kyle said, his voice a low vibration that traveled up Elian's arm. I am asking you to be what you are, a brilliant analyst. Help me find the cracks in the foundation. Help me bring it down. Outside the window, the city glittered, a monument to a cold, inhuman order. For the first time, looking at it, Elian did not feel fear. He felt a slow, burning spark of rage, the rage his mother had suppressed, the rage Cale had forged into a weapon. He looked at their joined hands, the black glove of the enforcer holding the pale, trembling hand of the hidden Omega. An impossible alliance, a shared purpose. Show me where to begin, Elian said, his voice quiet but clear and steady. The tremor in his hand had stopped. Their work took on a new, dangerous intensity. The subtext was now explicit, their secret collaboration a silent humming engine beneath the surface of their official duties. Elian, guided by Cale's insider knowledge, began to push Project Chimera into uncharted territory. He no longer modeled theoretical failures. He began to search for active, exploitable weaknesses. He cross-referenced energy grid schematics with personnel transport logs, looking for moments of maximum vulnerability. He analyzed the prefecture's communication network, identifying choke points and redundant systems that could be overloaded. He was no longer just an analyst. He was a saboteur. His weapon of choice, the cold, hard logic the consortium held so dear. Call acted as his shield and his guide. He would feed Elian classified data streams, disguised as routine updates for the project. He would subtly misdirect the archive's internal security audits, creating blind spots where Elian could work undetected. Their alliance was a delicate, high-stakes dance of data and deception. Valerius's scrutiny, however, did not wane. It sharpened. He began making unannounced visits to the archive, his presence a chilling harbinger of suspicion. He would stand behind Elian, his sterile ethanol scent a prickle of warning at the back of Elian's neck, and watch the data flow across the screen. "Your models have become increasingly alarmist, analyst," Valerius commented one day, his voice a dry rustle. "You seem preoccupied with worst-case scenarios." "Commander Kale has instructed me to explore all possibilities, no matter how improbable," Elian replied, his voice a perfect imitation of a dutiful subordinate. "To build a more robust system, we must first understand how it can be broken." Valerius's pale blue eyes shifted to Kale, who stood nearby. "A laudable goal, Commander, but one might argue that focusing on failure invites it. It breeds a certain decadent pessimism. The consortium was built on the relentless pursuit of perfection, not the cataloging of potential flaws." "Perfection is a process, not a destination, Commander Valerius," Kale countered smoothly. "To ignore flaws is to cultivate weakness. We are merely stress-testing the foundations." The ideological fencing was a regular occurrence, a battle of philosophies fought in the sterile quiet of the archive. But Elian knew Valerius was not a philosopher. He was a hunter, and he smelled something amiss. The physical and emotional strain on Elian was immense, but it was tempered by a new sense of purpose. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but it was no longer a paralyzing fog. It was a whetstone, sharpening his focus. His relationship with Call deepened in the quiet, stolen moments between their covert work. It was a bond built not on romance, but on a shared, desperate cause and a profound, unspoken understanding, an intimacy of shared risk. One evening, after a particularly grueling session of wargaming, a potential blackout scenario, Kale found Elian slumped at his console, his face pale with exhaustion. Kale placed a hand on his shoulder, a rare, overt gesture of contact. "You need to rest, Elian." "The simulation isn't complete," Elian murmured, not looking up from the screen. "It will be there tomorrow," Kale insisted. His hand was a warm, heavy weight on Elian's shoulder. It was grounding. He squeezed gently. "You are no use to me or to this cause if you burn yourself out. You are not just a processor. You are not a machine." The words were a direct refutation of the lie Kale himself had told Valerius. It was a quiet admission of Elian's humanity, his value beyond his function. Elian finally leaned back, the tension in his spine releasing with a shudder. He looked up at Kale, whose face was cast in the soft glow of the console. The Alpha's expression was unguarded, his usual military severity replaced by a deep, genuine concern. "I don't know how to stop," Elian admitted, the words raw, vulnerable. "For 12 years, all I've done is run. Now, I feel like I'm finally running towards something. I'm afraid if I stop, I'll lose it." "You won't," Kyle said, his voice firm. "I won't let you." The promise hung in the air between them, heavy and real. It was more than a promise of protection. It was a promise of partnership. In that moment, the line between handler and asset, between protector and protected, dissolved completely. They were simply two men against an empire bound by a shared past and a desperate hope for a different future. But the empire was watching. Valerius, frustrated by Kale's stonewalling, decided to change his tactics. If he couldn't get through the Alpha, he would go after the unremarkable tool. He began to apply pressure directly to Elian. It started subtly. Elian's access to certain data nodes would be inexplicably revoked, only to be restored hours later. His work would be subjected to random, intensive audits that forced him to scramble to hide the true nature of his research. Then, Valerius began to engage him in conversation, His questions casual but pointed, circling the nature of his work, his relationship with Kale, his thoughts on systemic stability. It was a slow, methodical interrogation designed to unnerve him, to find a crack in his composure. The final escalation came without warning. Elian arrived at the archive one cycle to find his workstation sealed off, marked with a crimson quarantine field. 2 heavily armed enforcers stood guard. Overseer Thorne approached him, his face ashen. "Analyst 734, he stammered, avoiding eye contact. "Commander Valerius has requested your presence in Biolab 7. There's been a bioanomaly detected in your sector." The lie was so thin it was transparent. Biolab 7 was not for environmental anomalies. It was where they processed, categorized, and cured biological impurities. It was where they took omegas. Elian's blood turned to ice. He looked for Kale, but the commander was nowhere in sight. Valerius had isolated him. He had sprung his trap. The game was over. The walk to Biolab 7 was a surreal, silent journey through the sterile white corridors of the consortium facility. The 2 enforcers flanked Elian, their presence a solid wall of intimidation, their footsteps echoing in perfect, synchronized rhythm. They did not touch him, but their proximity was a cage of its own. Elian's mind, usually so sharp and analytical, was a white noise of panic. He tried to think, to form a strategy, but there was nowhere to run. Kyle was not here. He was alone. He thought of the hypo spray in his pocket, the one Kyle had given him that morning. It was a suppressant, not a poison. It could not save him now. His only weapon was the lie he had maintained for 12 years, and he had a sinking feeling that it was no longer enough. The doors to Biolab 7 hissed open, revealing a room that was even whiter, even more sterile than the rest of the facility. It was less a laboratory and more a vivisection chamber. A single polished metal table stood in the center of the room under a bank of harsh, shadowless lights. Medical drones in articulated metal arms hung from the ceiling, their instruments gleaming. And standing by the table, waiting for him, was Commander Valerius. He was not in his formal uniform. He wore a stark white lab coat, a garment that made him look even more like a surgeon or a mortician. His thin, sterile scent of ethanol seemed to leach the very warmth from the air. "Analyst 734, Valerius said, his voice a dry, calm whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "Thank you for joining me. Please dismiss the escort." The enforcers bowed curtly and retreated, the door hissing shut behind them, leaving Elian alone with him. The silence was absolute. "There has not been a bioanomaly, as you have no doubt surmised," Valerius continued, steepling his long, thin fingers. "There has simply been a question that has been bothering me for some time. The question of Commander Kyle's disproportionate interest in an unremarkable beta analyst." He began to circle Elian slowly, like a shark studying its prey. His pale blue eyes were cold and devoid of any emotion save a detached scientific curiosity. "He protects you, Gay," Valerius stated, not as a question but as a fact. "He defends your work. He justifies the allocation of his valuable time to your, project. He has built a fortress of logic and protocol around you. It is an impressive construction, but it has a flaw. Its very existence implies that there is something precious inside worth protecting." He stopped in front of Elian, his gaze sharp, probing, and that is the question I have been asking myself. What is so precious about Analyst 734? Elian stood his ground, his body rigid, his face a mask of practiced neutrality. "I am a valuable asset to Project Chimera, Commander. My work is essential." "Your work, Valerius scoffed softly. "Your work is a symptom, not the cause. It is seditious. It is a detailed blueprint for insurrection, thinly veiled as risk assessment. But you are not the architect. You are the instrument. Kale is the architect, and an alpha like Kale, a man driven by a deep, personal vendetta against this system. He would not choose his instrument at random. He leaned closer, his voice dropping even lower. He would choose an instrument that was not only useful, but symbolic. He would choose an instrument that the system itself has wronged. He would choose an impurity. The word landed, and the finality of it stole the air from Elian's lungs. He knew. Valerius knew. The entire charade was over. We ran a microparticle analysis of the air filters in the archive, Valerius explained, a hint of triumph in his dry voice. We had to sift through terabytes of data, but we found it. A recurring pheromonal anomaly localized to your workstation. Faint, almost undetectable, the signature of a suppressed omega. He smiled, a thin, bloodless stretching of his lips. You see, analyst, in the end, the system always works. Precision always reveals the truth. You are not a beta. You are a lie. And today, your lie ends. Two medical drones detached from the ceiling, their metallic arms extending, one holding a hypospray, the other a set of restraints. We are going to cure you, Analyst 734, Valerius said, his voice soothing, hypnotic. We are going to correct the flaw in your biology. We will strip away the fear, the defiance, the personality. All that will be left is a pure, docile omega, a perfect, compliant asset, and then we will give you to Commander Kale as a gift, a demonstration to show him that no matter how hard he fights, the system always wins. The system always reclaims its property. Elian looked at the approaching drones, at the gleaming needle, at the cold, dead eyes of Valerius. He thought of his mother's empty gaze. He thought of the baker who smelled of yeast. He was not an asset. He was not property. A deep, primal rage, an emotion he had suppressed even more deeply than his own biology, surged through him. He would not let this man erase him. Just as the drone's arm reached for him, the heavy lab door exploded inwards. Not hissed open, exploded. A concussive blast threw one of the drones against the far wall in a shower of sparks. The other whirred, turning to face the new threat. Commander Kale stood in the ruined doorway, framed by smoke and shattered metal. He was not wearing his formal uniform. He was clad in black, lightweight body armor, a pulse rifle held at the ready. His face was a mask of cold fury, and his scent was unleashed. It was not the controlled, disciplined fragrance Elian knew. It was a raw, unrestrained torrent of pure alpha dominance. Ozone and iron, pine and scorched earth, a thunderstorm of pheromones that slammed into the room, a declaration of war. "Get away from him, Valerius," Kyle snarled, his voice a low growl that vibrated in Elian's bones. Valerius actually took a step back, his calm facade finally cracking, a flicker of shock and fear in his eyes. He had not anticipated this. A direct, violent assault. It was illogical. "Treason, Kale?" Valerius hissed, recovering quickly. "You would burn down your entire career, your very life, for a defective Omega?" "He is not defective," Kyle said, advancing into the room, his rifle leveled. "And you are not taking him." The remaining medical drone whirred and lunged at Kale. He didn't even flinch. He fired a single, precise shot from his rifle that blew the drone's primary motor apart. It crashed to the floor, twitching. Valerius's hand darted inside his lab coat, pulling out a compact sidearm. He was faster than Elian would have thought possible. He fired at Kale. Kale twisted, the pulse bolt searing the air where he had been, scorching a black mark on his armor. He didn't fire back at Valerius. He fired at the ceiling. The shot hit a conduit, and the bank of harsh overhead lights exploded, plunging the room into semi-darkness, lit only by the red emergency strobes that flickered to life. "Elian, move!" Kyle roared. The command broke Elian from his stupor. He scrambled away from the table, putting distance between himself and Valerius. The room was chaos. Valerius was firing blindly into the strobing darkness. Kale was using the shadows, moving with a predator's grace, returning fire with controlled, strategic bursts. It was not a brawl. It was a battle between two high-level tacticians. A pulse bolt hit Kale in the leg. He grunted in pain, stumbling, but never took his eyes off Valerius. He raised his rifle, but instead of firing at the man, he aimed at the control panel by the ruined door. He fired once. The panel sparked, and every system in the lab went haywire. Articulated arms swung wildly, containment fields flickered, and a high-pitched alarm began to blare. It was a chaotic, brilliant diversion. "The West Corridor!" Kyle yelled to Elian over the noise. "Go! Don't stop!" He gave Valerius one last burst of suppressing fire, forcing the other man to take cover behind the metal table. Kyle was injured. He was buying Elian time. The thought of leaving him was agony. "Go!" Kyle roared again, his voice raw with command and desperation. He met Elian's eyes across the chaotic, strobing room, and in that look was a clear, unmistakable order. "Survive!" Elian turned and ran. He sprinted through the ruined doorway, into the red-lit corridor, the alarms screaming behind him. He did not look back. He ran, his lungs burning, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He was running not from who he was, but for the man who had given him a reason to fight. He was no longer just hiding. He was escaping. The corridors were a blur of red emergency light and screaming alarms. Elian ran with a desperation he had never known, his body fueled by pure adrenaline. Kale's order, "Go, don't stop," was a frantic mantra in his mind. The West Corridor led to the service levels, a labyrinth of maintenance tunnels and ventilation shafts that snaked through the underbelly of the facility. It was a route Kale must have planned, a contingency he had prepared for. The thought that Kale had anticipated this level of failure, this violent outcome, was both terrifying and a testament to the Alpha's foresight. He found the access panel Kale must have meant, a small, unmarked hatch that he almost missed in his panicked flight. He wrenched it open and plunged into the darkness of a narrow ventilation shaft, pulling the hatch closed behind him. The cacophony of the alarms was instantly muffled, replaced by the loud, rhythmic rasp of his own breathing and the frantic pounding of his heart. The shaft was tight, claustrophobic, the air thick with the smell of dust and ozone. He crawled on his hands and knees, the rough metal scraping his skin. He was back in a small, dark space, but this was not a place of hiding. This was a path to freedom. Guilt gnawed at him, a sharp, bitter pain in his chest. He had left Kale. He had left him injured and facing Valerius, and whatever forces the commander would call upon. He had followed the order, but it felt like a betrayal. Yet he knew with a deep, gut-wrenching certainty that to have stayed would have been to waste Kale's sacrifice. Kale's goal was not to win that fight. It was to ensure Elian escaped. His survival was Kale's victory. That thought became his fuel. He crawled until his knees were raw, following the faint airflow that signaled a path to the outside. After what felt like hours, he saw it, a faint grid of lighter darkness ahead, a ventilation grate. He pushed against it with all his strength. It was heavy, rusted, but it finally gave way with a groan of tortured metal. He tumbled out onto a deserted landing platform in the lower levels of the city, the perpetual smoggy twilight of the prefecture a welcome sight. The air was thick with pollutants and the distant hum of city traffic, but it was real air. It was the air of freedom. He was out. He followed the rest of Kale's contingency, a set of instructions the Alpha had embedded in a data file disguised as a system schematic weeks ago. A location, a contact phrase. It led him to a grimy, nondescript noodle bar in a sector of the city the consortium's pristine towers cast in permanent shadow. He entered, his heart pounding, and spoke the phrase to the weary-looking beta woman behind the counter. "I hear the forecast calls for rain." The woman's eyes, tired and uninterested a moment before, sharpened with intelligence. She nodded once, then pointed with her chin to a back room. Inside, a small group of people, a handful of betas, and to Elian's shock, 2 other Omegas looked up as he entered. One of the Omegas was a young woman who smelled of fresh ginger and citrus, her scent open and unafraid. The other was an older man whose scent was a faint, pleasant aroma of old books and chamomile. They were not hiding. They were not suppressed. They were themselves. A man, a stern-looking beta with a scar down his face, stepped forward. "He sent you, the man asked, his voice rough. "Commander Kyle?" Elian could only nod, his throat tight with emotion. The man's expression softened. "We heard a full lockdown at the prefecture tower. We feared the worst. He got you out." "He stayed behind," Elian managed to say, his voice cracking. "He's been captured." A heavy silence fell over the small room. The ginger-scented woman placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Kale knew the risks," she said softly. "We all do. He's been a part of this for a long time, funneling us supplies, information, helping us get people out." Elian stared at her, the pieces clicking into place. Kyle was not just a lone wolf. He was part of a network, a rebellion. He had been fighting this war long before he ever met Elian. His plan, the scarred man said, was always to get to the central registry, the database that lists every registered Omega, every asset assigned to an Alpha. It's the cornerstone of their control system. He believed your work with Project Chimera was the key to finding a way in. Elian understood. Kale hadn't just been mapping weaknesses to cause chaos. He'd been searching for a specific key, a vulnerability that would lead to the heart of the system. The registry. In the days that followed, Elian became a part of their small, defiant world. They were a cell in a larger underground movement, a network of dissenters the consortium believed it had stamped out decades ago. He was no longer Analyst 734. He was just Elian. For the first time, he did not take a suppressant. He let the hypo spray Kyle had given him wear off, and he allowed his own scent, the fragrance of apricot and almond, to return. It felt strange, terrifying, and profoundly liberating to simply exist as himself without the chemical veil. And he worked. He took everything Kale had taught him, everything he had learned from mapping the system's flaws, and he focused it on a single target, the Omega Registry. He worked with a feverish intensity driven by guilt and a burning need to finish what Kale had started. He found it after weeks of relentless searching through encrypted backdoors and forgotten service protocols. A flaw in the system's logic, an exploit hidden in the very diagnostic programming Valerius had used to hunt him. It was a key. It was a weapon. The night they launched the attack, the small group gathered around his console. Elian's hands moved across the interface, his fear gone, replaced by a cold, sharp certainty. He initiated the program. A virus, disguised as a routine data update, wormed its way into the heart of the consortium's network. It did not destroy the registry. It did something far more subversive. It rewrote it. The designations were erased. The assignments were scrambled. The files of thousands of Omegas registered and hidden were corrupted, their data replaced with meaningless strings of code. He had not just opened the cages, he had destroyed the blueprints for them. It was an act of liberation on a scale he could never have imagined. In the chaotic aftermath, as the consortium systems reeled from the blow, a message found its way to their small cell through a series of encrypted channels. It was short, just a string of numbers, but when decoded, it formed a single phrase. Lilac and rain. Kale. He was alive. He had survived. Where he was, how he had sent the message, Elian didn't know, but he was alive, and he was fighting. Elian stood at a window looking out not at the gleaming towers of the prefecture, but at the sprawling, chaotic, beautifully imperfect city below. He was free. He was himself. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in his life he felt the stirrings of a fragile, defiant hope. The system was not perfect. It was not absolute. It could be broken. And in the quiet of his own mind, he sent a message back to the man who had shown him that. I'm waiting. The revolution had begun.